Welcome back to Bitwig. Today's modular concept is mixing. Now, it's easy to think of sound design and synthesis as being something that happens primarily beneath the audio level, with various kinds of control signals and other things taking over. Now that is true, but there is also the regular audio processing side of things, working with audio on the audio level, whether it's signal routing or effects. So even within our patch, we have the idea, the mixing concept of where do we insert a wave shaper? Does it come right after the predictable oscillator? So the shape is always the same, more or less. Or does it come after the envelope, where the dynamics of the sound are literally being changed and potentially giving you a dynamic signal? Or does it come after the resonant filter, which will just land in a place that's a bit more screamy? This is kind of choice one when we're dealing with audio, and that's before we even start talking about dealing with the normal channel strip, much less the mixer itself, which in Bitwig, as we've got modulators, it can be a unique and even frolicsome place. Before we even put things on the project level. So there's a lot based in our mixer that can be part of our sound design process if we consider it in that way. Now, before we start digging into three basic functions, let's just take a look at a couple tools that are available to make sure that we have everything in front of us. Number one, I was soloing this track to begin with so that we could hear things while clicking around. And you notice as I click, it is automatically disabling all the other soloed tracks on that first click. This is a mode if I right-click on any solo button called Exclusive Solo. And if this is disabled, then now that first click will let me hear multiple tracks at a time. So again, if I go back to Exclusive, now the second I click somewhere else, it will just turn off all the other solos. As you see in the window footer, shift-click will always do the opposite behavior. So if you mostly like Exclusive Solo, you can always hold shift and then click to add solos to what you've got. So that is one function that is useful. Another function that is useful, and you probably think of as a performance function, is the idea of solo as cue. All of our solo buttons become this cue button now, because what you might want to do in this instance is route this output to a different set of headphones, probably, and audition the sound that you're about to toggle to before you go there. That's nice and great, but I love this as a workflow function. So I'm going to turn the cue mix all the way up, and I'm going to hit play on my track. And this is exactly like solo in the first instance. I'm only hearing the one track with all of its auto panning glory. We can turn that off for now. And if I bring the cue mix down a little bit, I'm just relatively mixing this one track in terms of everything else, kind of dimming everything else so that I can hear the primary track that I'm focusing on. Or back to normal. I find this awfully useful when doing edits on vocal stuff or just sound design, to be able to focus on this one track while not losing perspective of everything else. In fact, oftentimes I'll just right-click this, map this to a controller knob, and then constantly have this cue level available because I find it pretty useful. But yeah, so right-clicking on any solo button gives you direct access to both of these functions without having to go find them. And now, 3 topics that are pretty useful. One, in terms of mixing, is the idea of gain staging. And this might be the most obvious, but if I had a single track here, we can hide our project business for now. If I had this single track here, adjusting the mixer volume is exactly the same as if I added another volume control that's not tied to any kind of processing function. Tool is really here just to give us these extra gain volumes. And I know people who love using this as a means to put in all of their volume automation on the timeline somewhere else, so that then when it's time for mixdown, you can just start with a clean mixer volume and no direct volume mappings itself, just to have something clean. Now that's one way to look at it, but a couple extra ideas here about gain staging. One, while audio tracks do have a volume mixer, like we've seen, and we could hear this little drum that was in the background. On the event level inside of Bitwig, there is also this idea of gain expressions, which can be pretty interesting because if you're dealing with audio, you can see visually an adjustment to what's there on screen as you do it. It's, in a sense, it's pre-gain because you are dealing with this on the source level before it passes through the rest of the signal flow and gets to the output. That can be awfully handy from the audio standpoint, but it can also be very interesting from the note standpoint. Once every note really is its own entity, you end up in this place where you can have individual gain for each track, and it can be awfully handy, particularly with this sort of thing. I've got a big heavy distortion device here. There we go. Now, if I were to adjust the gain before the effect, it has an enormous effect on the distortion, namely that it's not claiming as many victims, that it's not as strong and as vigorous as when there is a loud full tilt signal going into it. Now, compare this with adjusting the level on the channel itself. By changing this volume, now I'm preserving the tone that's going on because the distortion's still getting the thick signal that it's looking for, and I can then just adjust how much we're hearing. Now that's one way to look at it. Number 2, let's make this poly for a second. So now I've got 3 notes. We can bypass the distortion. And that's it. And that's fine. But as you see here, with each note, we also have the option of a gain expression, which then lets us kind of curve the individual notes' volume over time, which will create something interesting. That got a little greedy. Okay. So now we've got things undulating. Volumes changing over time, coming up and down, trading places, which if we hear it, just on its face, that's a more dynamic and interesting tone than the solid chord. But this can be particularly interesting when going into an effect that is sensitive to how much gain is being applied per voice. Because now this polyphonic mess will kind of get turned into something that pushes in different directions with distortion. And you hear the beating changing and taking over. And it becomes a bit more textural. Textural? It's a texture. That's what I meant. It's a texture. Now, that can be particularly interesting, either of these gain expressions for audio or for notes. And then one last thing about the idea of gain is I've got a simple organ here. A very nice, simple organ sound. Let's get a bigger spectrum. Now, it's interesting that if you look at the instruments we've got, there tends to be an output control, and there tends to be a voice gain control. The difference being that the output control, well, if I click a modulator, you will see these subtle color differences where this blue is kind of hinting at me, assigning it makes it more clear, that this is a monophonic source versus the voice gain, which turns out green, which is polyphonic. So if I were to modulate the output, it is changing it for every single voice, which may or may not be desirable, whereas the voice gain gives you individual polyphonic control. Why is this interesting, particularly to a synthesis-based person? Well, I want something that is pitch-driven here. I'm going to type pitch, and I'm getting some results that are, okay, pitch 12, sure, it's using the note key. That kind of makes sense. LFO. Why are some of these things showing up under pitch? Because they can be set and driven by the pitch of the note that is being played, which means fast. So the reason when we talk about synthesis that AM hasn't come up before is because it's kind of built into the entire system already. All of our polyphonic instruments have a gain control, or you could add one if it's a grid device. And we've got these LFOs. That do allow for audio rate modulation. So in this case, the LFO is tuned to the note I'm playing. I've got the fundamental and a couple octaves up, and that's, 3 octaves up, and that's pretty interesting. Now, back to mono and poly for 2 seconds. By default, the LFO is mono. It is not turned on poly. It's got the blue output, which means as I play one note at a time, it sounds great and it's tuned, but if I play different notes together, now we're going to get textural. Because that last note is tuning everything. If I set this to poly, this is where it becomes nice and interesting, because each individual note is maintaining its own shape and its own pitch. So yes, that's why we didn't talk about AM before. It's already everywhere. Could set this to a ratio as well. Half the pitch we played, twice the pitch we played, etc., etc. So pitch tracking becomes very interesting even with gain control. Now, one fundamental concept of all of this mixing talk and getting familiar with our mixer and the tools available to us is the idea of signal routing which we saw some in our original patch we were playing with. Thanks, Distortion. So in our original patch, we had some blend controls saying how much of the original signal would I like versus the old school transposed signal. So there's always an idea of blend, which is really just dealing with gain on a different level, but it is a sound design choice. It is a mixing choice. So something that could be useful here, like if we're thinking about an effect, oftentimes, let's have some bass in here. A lot of our effects do have a wet-dry control. And there's a reason for that. If we were adding delay plus here, we can hear the original delay, we can hear the second delay, that's what makes it delay. If we only heard the wet, then within the context, we don't even know where the original signal is landing. We're just kind of hearing something late and some feedback being applied afterwards. If there was no feedback, all we did was make the signal late. Oh, now it's on time. So the mix knob is really saying we want to balance the two of these things together. Hear some of the dry, some of the wet, and hear the overall effect. Now, that can be pretty critical, so much so that some people like using it in a place where it is not usually available. So parallel compression. A normal compression, a compressor will always have a ratio control, a threshold control, probably some attack release gain, etc. That's enough in the traditional sense. So if I've got a compressor here, there's not usually a wet-dry knob, but Bitwig has considered that. So there is a chain device, which, as advertised, it's a chain. It has a chain for processing. If I then drag the compressor into the chain, and then adjust the mix control, I have a wet-dry control on top of everything else. Just compressed. Not compressed. Or a mixture of both with compensation in there. And additionally, there's often a gain control here just to make up the wet side if I want to hear it more, but not blend it quite as strong, or whatever you want to do. So this is a useful familiar structure, whether it's a Bitwig device that you want to use or any plugin. Just having the ability to immediately create a routing structure that looks very simple, but it could be complex. This could be a compressor followed by a delay, followed by a reverb with all different dry wet settings. It doesn't matter. It scales because you can use it however you like. And then the third point that's worth looking at for a moment, once you get to this idea of signal routing, now we're talking about part of a signal going one place and part of a signal going to another. We had this little sprinkly track here in the beginning. And obviously on a track by itself, a blend control, a wet-dry control makes some sense, but an aux send can also make sense. So over here on top of everything, I've got an aux track with a nice little convolution, which is reasonably big. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Let's make it a little bit longer. Which I've just labeled distance because I want to use this as a bit of a distance effect. From the view of the aux, I could even adjust levels on what's coming into the aux, and you can see the fader on this track is moving up. Now, the thing is, if I wanted to keep this as a distance effect, and I want to bring down the track volume, I lose both because they're coupled together. Everything right now on these auxes is living in a post-fader world. That is the default, saying we're going to apply the volume before the send takes place. And again, all I did is right-click on the aux to see these options. Now, I've got two choices. I've got this one selected. I could switch it over to say, your default behavior is now pre-fader. Now, even if I bring the gain down, the reverb effect will still get plenty of signal, or however much I've set here. So now I have an independent control if I want to sprinkle things that way. That's one choice. The other choice is that I leave the aux normal in a post-fader sense, and you could see the colors change here when I did that. And just for this individual send, I could right-click on it. Just this channel going there. Okay, it was trusting the track, which is why the pre-fader switched things. Well, I'm just going to make this one send by itself pre-fader. Now I've got the blue here, the yellow here. If I were to turn this up on a different track, it still stays yellow in the regular post-fader way. Shift-click, because we're in exclusive. And then it'll work. So the aux sends can be critical as well. And having those options there for either remapping this individual one or controlling the whole send itself, those can be interesting. So we've looked at everything that's available on the mixer itself. Now let's use it. How about a twist? We have looked at all the functions of the mixer, including volume, including sends, including all kinds of things that we can send around. So what might be interesting here, I'm disabling auto arm for a purpose. What if our mixer was our synthesizer? Let's just think of it that way for a moment. So I'm going to go ahead and I've got an instrument track. I'm going to browse for a sound. Maybe I want something clean. There's a tag called clean. I will hit tab. Okay. Now, what type of sound do I want? Maybe an organ. Oh, clean organ. Look at that. That feels simple and good enough. Now, what might be interesting, I want to go ahead and duplicate this track. Because what I'm going to do on all of these tracks, I do also have a monitor option. If I look at the input, and I'm going to say it's always on, because I am turning my mixer into a synthesizer. Playing a note on any track should trigger every track. So I'm going to take the second track, maybe put it up a fourth. Maybe I can pan these a little bit. Cool. Now let's think like a synthesizer. I'd like to group these because I want them controlled by the same volume. And okay, let's just go straight to the project level. I think I'd like something that can delay after a moment. So I have an envelope, which I found by typing in delay. Yes, let's have a pre-delay. Let's say wait about 2 seconds. Ooh. Let's say wait about 2 seconds before we go. Have a single trigger. Have a nice little fade in here and a shape. Okay. So what are we doing? I'm going to play notes and nothing's going to happen for a moment. And then I want the envelope to come in. Now, how do I do that with these modulators? I'm on the project level. I have a page of modulators, and there I can define the incoming keyboard. Well, let's just take all inputs. That's a safe bet. That's pretty cool. Nice. While we're at it, hide that for now. Why don't we go ahead and add some kind of standard ping-pongy left, right, a little bit of feedback, a little bit of wash. Okay, just so we can have something that rings out a little bit. Not bad. Time to add another element, because I'm thinking in this structure way where everything is just a separate signal path and I've got certain advantages, including I could have totally different note effects, audio effects, whatever I'd like. Maybe in this case, let's try a synthesizer. What type of synth would I like? Maybe a lead. And I want to try tags, maybe something a little bit digital. Ooh, C64. You had me. Okay. Always. The longer I hold the notes, I'll get that organ coming in the background. Of course, this wants some delay too. Nice. That's not bad. Now, instead of building this as a grid patch, again, I do have separate paths available to me. So if I click plus before the instrument, it knows I want a note effect. Maybe I want something to stutter a little bit, and note repeats might be the trick. I'm going to give it its own life. But not everything. Yes, I've heard of this Euclidean. I would like to try it. That's kind of fun. That's kind of fun. I could do a lot more here on the track level, but maybe this is good enough. I want another layer. What do I want? Sound packages. Cool. Perfect drift. Interesting. Some analog-y stuff here. Okay. Maybe I would like a pad. Yes. Maybe I would like some wordplay. Padlands. Excellent choice. So, now what do we have? That's not bad. Maybe I want to animate this a bit with some craziness, maybe some kind of multi-effect. What is there? Oh, I've got something favorited. Maybe that's a good way. I can just see my favorites now. Autopilot. Yeah, that might create some mono tension, kind of the way we did with gain earlier. And as just one final thought that we didn't look at with auxes, if I was to add some kind of convolution here, I'm not even going to route signal over there. I've already got most of my other sounds going into the delay, which is nice. So maybe the delay should feed the convolution. And consequently, maybe the convolution should feed back into the delay. It's a different way to think about synthesis. All because our mixer has power and some expressiveness already, with the option to modulate things directly. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next time.